Yo, it's your boy Professor SentZ, Lab Science Podcast, episode 36, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think I'm mistaken. Shout out to 36 Chambers, Wu-Tang and Clan, ain't nothing to fuck with. Had plans on having Lean on the episode this week. Big shout out to the homie. We're having some technical issues. We record on different coasts, and the platform that we use to normally record is not working for whatever reason. But we've been preaching consistency, so I definitely didn't want to go a week without speaking to you guys and gals out there. So hope all is well with the big homie. We'll have him back hopefully next week. Before we get started with the lab report and this week's news in the music front, I wanted to talk about the general scope of the podcast. We talk about DJing, mixing, mastering, all this stuff, but Lab Science is definitely a producer-focused podcast first. And the reason why we bring in these other topics is because I think the modern producer has to have their hands versed in all this stuff. You have to perform. You have to know how to write songs and mix a bit. So when we talk about mixing concepts and DJing and all this other stuff, it is from the lens of a modern producer. And I think going forward, both Lean and I want to do a better job at communicating the brand being a producer-focused podcast. We want to niche down a bit to make sure that folks that are making music, that are behind these instrumental productions and these songs, have a podcast that's for them. So that's what we're here for. And you will see the topics reflect that going forward. Last thing before we get into the good bits, you can do a lot in terms of helping the growth of the pod in as little as a minute or two. Like and subscribe us. If you're listening on Apple Music, please rate and review the podcast. It goes a long way on the analytics side and helping us gain things like sponsorship and visibility. If you have friends that are into music, let them know what we do, man. Send them our way, and it could be something that benefits our community overall. I'm thinking about a Slack channel. I've been using Slack for other producer groups, other engineering groups, and I think it's a real cool hub for creatives to keep everything under one umbrella. I really want to spend more time talking to you directly and getting your personal input. So if you use Slack already, if Slack is a platform that you think could be good for that, it allows you to share files, chats, announcements. It's a real good all-in-one resource. If that's something that you'd fuck with, let me know. If I see enough interest, I'll definitely go ahead and set that up. Just let me know via the social media. Hit us up on YouTube. Hey, SentZ, I want a Slack channel. I'd be a part of that community. And I'll make sure it's open and accessible if it's something people are interested in. All right, we got a lot to get into this week. I actually, in full disclosure, recorded this episode already and had to re-record it. So this has been a hell of a day, but we got to do what we got to do. You feel me? So the first thing I wanted to talk about was this new move from Facebook. They are announcing premieres, which is really a rehashing on their live video content. You now can pre-schedule a live video, and this is huge. I personally see it as a big opportunity for musicians. I know it seems kind of counterintuitive to pre-schedule something live, but I know a lot of folks are hesitant to do live video. They might be nervous about their performance or just about the capabilities of their internet connection or their equipment. So you're really hesitant to get in front of all of your Facebook friends and say, hey, I might fuck up. This might be completely embarrassing. And I think Facebook is aware of that. So what you can now do is record the video ahead of time, do it in the privacy of your home, and then a week ahead of time, you can schedule a live event, and Facebook will show that video and people can watch it together just like you're doing a live stream. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. This is awesome for music videos, for beat makers. If you make beats and record the process, you can then trim down that and then have like a live beat making show every week. There's so much opportunity and potential for this. I think it's really interesting to see Facebook is now pushing us towards group activity, because you think about it, the big difference between this and a regular video is that people all watch it at the same time. So they're commenting together, they kind of gather together around this event. And that's something that you don't really get as much as you used to in the past, now that the internet is what it is. But it also has the added benefit of Facebook pushing the notification to everybody's feed. And if you're consistent and you have something that's weekly or bi-weekly or monthly where you're showcasing your art, maybe you're putting up a weekly recap of your beat making sessions, or your most recent beat could be a live release every week or other week. As long as you're doing this consistently, you get that snowball effect of a consistent audience. When people see things happen at a set time every time, they become more dependent on it. They become more expective of it. It gains social proof. And it makes you look more reliable because you are. If you show up to bat every week, I want to work with you more because I know you're going to be that consistent with me. So use this as an opportunity to make yourself more top of mind. I personally didn't do a lot of live stuff because my internet connection where I am is trash. So this is a cool opportunity for us to kind of meet in the middle. I could definitely see myself doing more live style content for both Lab Science and my personal Facebook page now that this is a thing. I also would wager that within a year, this will be moved on to Instagram. So even if you're not big on Facebook, use this time as Facebook rolls this process out to study how it works, to get comfortable with it, so that when they eventually do move it to Instagram, because it's the same company on a different rollout, you'll be well versed in it and you'll know how to operate in the landscape and schedule live events ahead of time. Moving on in the lab report, Moog has announced the Moog One, which is a new logical successor to the Moog Voyager. They discontinued in 2015. It's the first polysynth that Moog has announced in a couple of decades. So historically, it's a really, really cool thing. They have an 8-voice and a 16-voice version. The 8-voice is 6 racks, $6,000. The 16-voice is $8,000. Pricey unit. It comes with 3 oscillators. Oscillators are sound sources in case you don't work with synthesizers. 2 filters, which is really cool. One is the normal low-pass Moog filter. The other one is a multi-variable filter, or the variable state filter. So it can be used as a low-pass, high-pass, band-pass. And that's really nice. I like personally making really dirty low-end sounds and really distorting the low-end on Moog sounds and using that low-pass filter to just focus in on that. But then being able to clean things up afterwards with the high pass filter is a nice option. And you can do that on like the Model D, for example. So it's a real cool addition. You normally don't see the state variable filter on all of their standard keyboards. It's usually more in the modular stuff. You can run the filters in parallel or serial. If you're not aware, basically that means we've got 2 types of filters, so they can either run into each other or they can run side by side, and you run your oscillators through each of them, and then it sums the output at the end. I really like running things side by side, mainly because you can use one of those filters as your really dirty, distorted, colorful filter, and then you can use the other one as your clean one. And that allows you to make really, really strange artifacts on one chain, but the other chain has the pure sound of the synth note that you're looking for, and then you can blend to touch and mix and see how you want that to work. It is a tri-timbral synth, which means it's essentially 3 separate synthesizers at once, and each one has its own sequencer, ARP, and effects routing. So you can make really, really huge sounds. There's 4 LFOs, 3 envelope generators. There's an XLR input, a 1/4-inch input, 4 1/4-inch inserts, CV gate. It sounds amazing, right? But I really had to kind of step back and ask myself, do I care? And this is no shade to Moog at all. They're an amazing company. I really like the model. Their parts are definitely worth what you pay for because you get great sounding gear and you know it's made with a great attention to detail. But I also am aware that as things move on to plugins, as things move on to digital hardware, although you can't necessarily get the same sound as a Moog, you can probably get the same level of fun interaction with other pieces of gear. You can probably get to more sound sources with different pieces of gear, considering the same price point. If I have $6,000, I can probably get a lot more stuff than I would just get out of that Moog. You know, there's just so many pieces of software and hardware that could do more for what it's worth. And I think Moog, a lot of its audience does stem from producers who understand the value of those high quality parts, but also have a bit of a nostalgia for them. But I'm very aware of this up and coming generation of producers that grew up knowing digital only, and I don't see them being as invested. So I can't help but wonder, how long is this going to work? Like, Moog does a really good job with iOS apps. They've made it clear they can. I would really like to see more development on that front. before we see another one of these expensive keyboards that most of us can't afford. They just got rid of the Moog line. It would be a real cool time to make iPad and iOS versions of those pedals. I would be really more invested into something like that than another big keyboard that most producers just can't afford. And even if they could afford, probably can't qualify considering what else you can get for $8,000. It's cool. If anybody has a spare one or a spare $8,000, feel free to give me either. Please know that if you give me the latter, I'm probably not going to spend it on a Moog One. There's just a lot more bang for the buck that you can get for that kind of money. But it's cool to see them still making high quality, cool shit for sure. The last thing I wanted to discuss in the lab report this week was this new partnership between HD Vinyl and GZ Media. HD Vinyl is a new technology. It's very similar to the records that we play and love, except the audio quality is a lot higher. It's about 30% better. And you can also play more music on a record. The standard vinyl allows 22 minutes per side. These allow about 30 minutes per side. So basically, GZ Media is one of the leading vinyl pressing plants in the world. They've made a partnership that allows them to add new equipment to their plants so they can print HD vinyl discs and be the leading distributor in that front. They've announced that HD Vinyl is working with a bunch of other distributors, but GZ Media is one of the big ones. And it's just a good sign that the industry is trending in the right direction. Vinyl sales are up. We're now in the tens of millions range, which is absurd. But it's one of those things where this will lead to the price point coming down. This will lead to more modernization of the hardware. And that's the bigger thing to think about. I think there's a huge opportunity as a producer for you to see vinyl in your future, especially if you work in hip hop, especially if you work in younger genres of music. We've been preaching this for recent weeks, but less and less producers need to rely on lyricists and artists and vocalists anymore. We can put out more instrumental pieces. We can put out just more artistic-minded pieces and other options in terms of getting money. And merch is one of the big ones. So combining the physical art, combining merch, combining media, and pitting that in vinyl, and having it as something you can sell, on your Bandcamp or on tour, which is another huge revenue stream we talked about. It's a no-brainer that's getting more and more becoming more and more of a no-brainer. Everyone gets streaming media bombarded at them, and people will start to gravitate towards what they don't get a lot of. So if you have a more personal experience where you can give someone something physical, and it's a cool thing like an HD vinyl, it just makes sense to consider that. So start thinking about it. I encourage you to look at this platform. I encourage you to look at technologies like this when they're developing, because there's usually opportunities for artists early on to develop relationships. Someone's going to do something smart with GZ Media directly, and mark my words, they're going to benefit from it on the sales side of things. So that concludes the lab report. A couple of concepts to talk about this week. Hit me up, labsciencepodcast@gmail.com, if you see anything in the news this week that you want discussed. Before we get on to some Tchnique, I wanted to talk about Creative Quest, the book from Questlove. I just finished it up. And fascinating read, first of all. It's a real cool book, mainly for musicians, but I guess for creatives in general, where Questlove of the Roots talks about creative practices and techniques to get you kind of doing more. And one thing that I thought was really amazing and inspiring, he talks a lot about his DJing, and something that he does, he was aware that people, when they go out, it's cool seeing like genius level planning, but he was aware that when people go out, they tend to decide, all right, I'm going to stay out until 12 or 1 or 2 or whatever. They always decide they're going to leave on an hour point. And when you're deciding if you're going to stay at a bar, you say, all right, I'm going to stay another hour. I'll stay till 1. I'll stay till 2. So what he did to counter people leaving on the hour, let's say we're talking about 1 o'clock. At 12:50, he'd be playing the best records of that hour. He saved the top shit, the fire, the heat from his collection for 10:50 to 11, for 11:50 to 12, for 12:50 to 1, so that when you're in that last 10 minutes looking at your watch going, all right, I guess it's time to go, you're hearing all those songs that make it hard for you to leave. And I thought that was a real incredible example of that 80-20 rule that we talked about. Where, and again, go back, I think it's an episode or two ago. No, it was last episode where we talked about 80% of your gains stemming from 20% of your efforts. This type of pre-planning from him is a minor tweak. He doesn't have to learn any new way of DJing. He probably doesn't have to add any new songs to do this. But all he has to do is be aware of when to play certain records. It's a little tiny tweak. It's a 20% tweak in his nightly day. He's doing everything else the same. But he talks about how successful it was. He'd watch people as they started to go to the coat room, just turn around and come back. And then all of a sudden, they're the people that are there till 5 a.m. So I wanted to bring it up just to encourage going forward when you're planning how to be better and how to do better. Again, it's not always about getting more gear or overcomplicating things. Sometimes it's just about observing patterns. And this was Quest seeing a pattern that he saw and kind of responding to it, saying, damn it, I have this problem. How can I fix this without requiring too much output? I will link to the book. I do a lot of, I go through a lot of these books via Audible. I love audiobooks. So I'll link to the Amazon link and the Audible link for Creative Quest. He does the narration on this one. I always dig that. Real cool book. Definitely encourage any creatives to check it out. So going back to our focus on producers, and again, I don't want people to fear that we're never going to talk about mixing again. We're about to talk about mixing now. But I want to make sure that when we talk about things like engineering and mixing, it's from the mindset of a producer. And a big thing for me when it came down to getting better at mixing my beats and mixing beats specifically that I place came down to a technique that I like to call the K.I.S.S on the bus method. Okay? And this doesn't mean you get on public transportation and find someone that looks cute and go and ask for a kiss, because I don't want you guys hitting me back talking about you had any creep issues. That's gross. The K.I.S.S on the bus method is a combination of two ideas. First is the K.I.S S, K-I-S-S, which is an acronym that we've heard time and time again for Keep It Simple, Stupid. There's so many plugins, there's so many things you can do as an engineer and as a producer. When it's time to start mixing your beats and your songs, you probably do too much. And I really excelled with getting better end results. I'm not talking about the mixing process and looking cool and knowing every compressor and all this shit. I got better sounding mixes the more simple I made the mixing process. So the first part of this is just that. Keep it simple, stupid. We're trying to do less in our mixing process without cutting any corners, just being more efficient in what we do. The second half of this, the on the bus of the K.I.S.S on the bus method, is mixing on the bus. And if you've never mixed before, or if you don't use this way of mixing, you can either put effects directly on the individual channels. So you put a compressor on your kick, and then something on your snare, and then something on your hats, and something on your percussion. Or you can route all of these individual channels into one channel called a bus. In this case, it would be a drum bus. Let's say we route all of our drums to that bus, and we start to do our effects there. And yes, it offers less of a focused look, and it offers you less control over the individual pieces, but that's a good thing in my opinion at this stage. I think it's important to think about the overall song in pieces. So when I make a beat, when I'm mixing a beat, I'm thinking of the rhythm section as a whole, the drums as a whole, the melodics as a whole, the synth elements versus the natural instruments as a whole, and all of these wholes become buses. So when I start to think about my drums, I'm not just thinking, how does the kicks sound? How does the snare sound? The first thing I'm thinking is, how do the drums sound? And there are certain overall things that I can do to the drums to get to my vision before I need to start tinkering with the finer details. So I tend to route my drums, for example, to a bus. I might do corrective EQ on the individual channels, but that usually doesn't happen until later. On that drum bus, I can start to add tape saturation. I can start to add EQ and compression and use leveling of the individual channels as a way to make sure the big picture of the drums is pretty close. And then I usually go back to fixing the little individual parts to get to that last bit that I need. But what always happens, I end up doing less than I would have if I went the other way around. For most of my career as a producer, I would mix the kick, mix the snare, mix the hi-hat, mix all that stuff, then send it to a bus, and then completely change things on the bus and have to usually go back and tweak again. So I find going top down, at least in that regard, helps me out quite a bit. Sounds are so good now. You know, there's so much high quality audio, plugins, samples. You usually don't have to do as much as you used to get the audio fidelity there. And if you find yourself really making a lot of changes to a kick, you probably should just replace the kick. You know, like there's not this scarcity that had to get fixed in the mix. I really do believe in creating like there's no mixing process. So by the time you get to the mixing stages, it's more about fixing any problems and then mixing for a feel. And when you're dealing with buses, that's how you get a feel. I send all of my natural instruments to one bus so I can then do the same type of tape saturation on them, do the same type of compression on them, the same kind of EQ things on them. And by the time all that's done, the level is better, but they also sound more cohesive because they've ran through the same sets of coloring stages. And that's really what the bus side of this is for. But the last big benefit on it before we move on to our main topic, most of us don't have supercomputers. So if you have to have a bunch of plugins on each track, you're going to kill your DAW. I'd rather use what I need on the bus and then add a couple of additional things on each channel, and my CPU was cleared up for me to continue working without having to stop and freeze. I don't freeze things until I archive them. I can just keep working and mixing and working and mixing. So K.I.S.S on the bus, it's a super simple method. You didn't have to take dedicated notes for it because they are in the show notes. Just hit our comments there, and while you're there, go ahead and like and subscribe. All right, so our main topic this week, and again, hit me up, labsciencepodcast@gmail.com. Let me know what you want discussed in future weeks. But I wanted to talk about beat making versus producing. And I think the first thing to do is to define things as how I see it, because these are such loose terms that everyone has a different definition for them. My perspective on it actually changed. I think for a while I considered producing to be when somebody rapped to or sang on your beat. You are a beat maker until somebody rapped on your stuff or sang on your stuff. When you guys put a song out, you're a producer. I then started thinking you have to have some kind of input on that song being made before you can call yourself a producer. Otherwise, you're a beat maker that just sold a beat. Then I stopped thinking so hard about it because I think it's really divisive and dangerous. But now I'm at a point where I really do look at the word producer in its most literal sense. A producer makes a thing. And that could very well be a song with a vocalist on it. That could be an instrumental piece that you publish. That can be a beat that you put on Spotify, a beat that you sell to a blog or a vlogger for their background music. I think the second you decide you want to make an end product with your instrumental work, if you make that end product, you're a producer. You've produced a product. It's a pretty literal situation. That being said, there's this scary negative connotation that's been attached to beatmaker that I think isn't fair and isn't helpful. There's absolutely nothing wrong with making beats as a process just because you enjoy it. You're pretty lucky if you can have a bad day, and we all have them, and you then sit down in your chair and you make a beat, and the second you're done, whether or not the beat was finished or whatever, you feel better. That's something that I fear people don't give enough credit. I started making beats when I was in high school a long time ago, and I never really made them to sell them, but it definitely made me less depressed. I was a suicidal kid for a while, and it stopped, just straight up stopped when I was able to come home after school, and instead of having to think about bullies all day or think about whatever was stressing me out all day, I was able to just make a beat. So I get really nervous and I get really upset when I see people, say, oh, I'm not a beat maker. I'm more than that. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's a problem when you're deep down trying to produce a product. You're trying to be a producer and you haven't admitted it to yourself yet, or you haven't taken the necessary steps to then hit that product. What usually happens is we have a lot of folks that are comfortable with the beat making side of things, but also have intentions of working with artists or putting out an instrumental piece. And then they don't do the other things that are necessary for that. So they're quick to label themselves beat makers as such. And that's not it. You're a producer that needs to finish a product. So it's really about what your end game is. I think that's important to establish first before you start giving yourself this negative connotation that we've attached to beat making, because there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. So part of the bad angle that comes with calling yourself a beat maker, I think people assume that there's not a path forward or a path from that, and I think that's just completely false. First of all, I think the first step is to admit to it and say, hey, I have an experience with music that allows me to be happy when I do it. So that's why I do it. When people ask you what you do, you say, I'm a beat maker. You know, I leave home, I go home after work and I make music and it clears my mind. It's my therapy. That's okay. That's a great thing to be able to say. But the second thing to really remember and to kind of shed that negative connotation on being a self-admitted beat maker is that it's not a permanent state. And it's something that people often bounce back and forward between. I would wager that in recent weeks, maybe in recent months, my focus has been more on production. I'm trying to work with rappers. I'm trying to place beats with licensable entities. And as such, there's a product in mind. So I've been focusing my efforts on that. Prior to that, I think I was in a really heavy beat making stage. I was learning about new things. I was readapting myself to the climate, getting heavy into sound design. There were 2 years of sessions where I just had joints to play with. Now that I've refocused efforts on placing, I can pull from that period where I was beat making and use those sessions as something to produce a full record with. So it's a sound designing period. It's a time period that's super essential for you as a producer. Beat making is a thing you need. They work hand in hand. And if you have somebody telling you otherwise, take a look at their output and see if they even have the right to do so. So the last thing we'll talk about is making that transition the other way, going from beat making to producing. If that's something that you're struggling with, how do you do it? Well, there's two ways that I think are important. The first is collaborating, because when you get two people in the room, you're way more prone to wanting to have an end result happen. Lean and I do this pod together and collaborate together because when there's two parties involved, there's way more chances at it finishing. And there's way more chances at it being something tangible that we both can point to. When it's just you working on something, it's very easy to feel like you've got something finished or you've accomplished something because you know all the work that went into it. But it takes somebody else being able to see where you're at before you can decide if it's an actual tangible product or just time spent towards something. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's different. When it's time to produce, it's time to produce. So the first step would be get somebody else in the room. I can't stress that enough. The second is prioritizing. Often we'll have difficult times figuring out what we want to produce because we want to produce everything. Focus on one thing. Do you want to work with vocalists? Do you want to make a beat tape? Do you want to perform? What's the thing that you want to do the most? And then focus what you learned in your beat making efforts and put that towards the product that you have in mind. So that's episode 36, guys. If you have any questions, hit me up via email, labsciencepodcast@gmail.com. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And again, like and subscribe. The support goes a long way for our analytics. We appreciate your time and love. Professor SentZ, peace.